Hey guys, I'm Ethan with goBILDA, and today we're going to do an overview of the FTC Into the Deep goBILDA Robot in 3 Days. For this year's Robot in 3 Days, we got 3 amazing students from the FTC Team 10355 Project Peacock. They had a fantastic last season, including being an Alliance Captain at Worlds, but they started this one by coming here to Winfield, Kansas to participate in our Robot in 3 Days. In the Robot in 3 Days, we live stream 15 hours of building, where at the end we have a robot that can play this season's FTC challenge. Now this year's Robot in 3 Days felt a lot like last year, where we got a team of active students and they were a blast. It was super fun to build with them the whole time. But the biggest way this year was different was in where we started. Last year we started with a chassis and some loose ideas, but this year we were able to start with the FTC Starter Kit robot. Now this is new for goBILDA this year, and it's an example robot built entirely out of the starter kit, which can play this year's game. This gave us a lot of jumping off points that we even capped in the final version of the robot. Things like the arm and a lot of the design language from the intake and wrist system carried right over and gave us an amazing starting place that we could build and improve on. Now the arm and intake system is about where the similarities between these two robots ends. This year we started by looking at the drive system. We loved a lot of the advantages you get from a Cannon drive this year, mostly being able to intake much easier from that submersible. Being able to just move sideways instead of backing up, rotating, and driving back forward means that you could collect the exact sample you want from the submersible much quicker. Now we started with a Strafer chassis, which is a standard for Robot in 3 Days, and as always, we modified it. This year we went with a different length of drive rail and a different crossbar to make this robot smaller. We made the robot about 3 inches shorter by going with a 14-hole drive rail instead of a 17-hole drive rail, and we made it about 2 inches narrower by going with an 8-hole crossbar. This lets the robot fit in tighter packages, and it better lets us use that 42-inch extension limit that we're working around this year. Because of that shorter drive rail, we stood our front drive motors up. The other advantage of this is that it moves our center of gravity a little further forward, which is nice when we're really moving this long arm up and down. One of my favorite parts of the Strafer chassis is the ability to put your motors vertical like this. It creates a ton of design flexibility and it makes working on a Strafer just a pleasure. Now moving up from that drive base, we started by just taking a copy of this scoring arm and bolting it to that Strafer. That meant we had the same 51-to-1 motor driving a 5-to-1 gear reduction into these mini low-side channels. This is a super solid arm system, and that motor ratio is really appropriate for even the extending intake we put on the end of this. Now we started by just bolting a 2-stage Viper slide kit to this arm. That meant there was an additional piece of channel, which adds a little bit of weight, and so on the last day of the stream, we went ahead and rebuilt that system. It meant that we could move the whole arm shorter, which gave us more room inside the 18-inch box to fit our intake, and it meant we could move the motor up here. Now this is a bit of an unorthodox place for your lift motor in a belt drive system, and you need these 2 idlers to pull the belt back and around the motor pulley. Now this is nice because you get a lot of wrap around that motor pulley, so you can have relatively low belt tension while still having enough torque to move that system in and out. Like I mentioned, this is a 2-stage Viper slide system with our intake mounted on the end, so we get a pretty good amount of extension. Now when the intake is all the way down, we don't have to worry about the 42-inch extension limit, but we do need to pull the intake in a little bit before we raise the arm. This is something that a software limit could really easily do, and it's something we did implement for the code for the Robot in 3 Days. I really love the extra 2 inches of extension we get on the intake by shortening those drive rails. And I think you're going to see more and more short robots this year in order to take full advantage of the extension you can get to reach into the submersible. Now this intake took a lot of design inspiration from the starter kit robot. The first thing we wanted to look at was what a larger wheel would do. The starter kit comes with 72mm Gecko wheels, and we ended up with a 96mm wheel in this version of the intake. Now that 96mm wheel gives us a little more reach, and it gives us a little more flexibility in the geometry of the intake. With a smaller intake wheel, you have to be super careful with exactly how far away that wheel is from the back and bottom plate, and the 96mm gives you just a little bit more flexibility there. We also added these 2 32mm Omni wheels on bearings so that this can skate across the surface of the ground and we don't have to worry about driving that full force into the tile and scraping things up. We're super happy with how this intake system worked out. Now we designed this whole robot to really tackle scoring samples in the high basket, and we didn't spend a lot of time refining it to score specimens. The starter kit robot can score specimens, and I think this robot had the ability to as well, but that wasn't our priority. We really wanted to be a great robot at scoring in that high basket, and some additional mechanism or time refining the intake I think would make a robot like this pretty good at scoring specimens as well. Now, day 3 of the Robot-in-3-Days this year didn't have a lot to do with scoring and teleop. We were super happy with how our samples were scoring, and we did rebuild the arm a little bit, but our primary focus was trying to get to that level 3 ascent. That second bar is really hard to get to, and we had tons of ideas. Stuff like having 2 actuator kits, having the arm be able to fold up and pull us up to that third bar, the third level, but we didn't end up with anything that we were really happy with. Certainly nothing we could execute in 15 hours. I know I'm really excited to see how teams actually solve this problem because I think it's one of my favorites that we've seen in FTC recently. It's super challenging and it's crazy fun. Now, we worked on this until basically the last hour of the stream where we said, we don't think we can quite get a level 3 ascent out. Let's shift our focus and make a really fast and really solid level 2 ascent, which means we're hanging on that first bar. Now, in the rush to get the show done in time, we went ahead and put a single actuator kit on the side of the robot. This is a linear actuator kit, and we added a piece of channel, a piece of 3-hole channel with a piece of 1-hole channel to act as a hook. Now, this length of actuator kit coupled with this hook, coupled with this robot, doesn't quite lift the robot all the way off the ground. So while it was super quick to go and attach, it just didn't quite work out like we were hoping. And we didn't quite have the time to really refine this system to something that's very fast. So we took some notes from the starter kit robot, we put a 1-hole channel on the arm, and because that arm is the same ratio, this robot is totally able to do that same pull-up hang that we saw and like on the starter kit robot. So while it's not quite as fast or refined as we were hoping, this actuator kit would make an awesome option. It just takes that little bit more tweaking of the geometry of the system to create a super fast level 2 ascent. One of my favorite parts of this Robot-in-3-Days is this Viper slide system. I see a ton of teams run 2 Viper slides that are opposing each other. This creates a really strong lift system, but this single supported slide system is totally adequate for scoring with a light intake and a light scoring element, but it's important to note that I don't think you could hang your robot off of just this one slide. We also spent more time on cable management this year. This year we have this cable chain, which is pulled into the robot by surgical tubing, which makes sure these servo wires don't get pinched or caught anywhere. Wiring is always a struggle on lift systems, and we wanted to include this cable chain as an example of a way to do it where those wires are really protected and really smoothly run back inside the robot systems. This year we're doing something a little different in that we will be including CAD and a bill of materials for this robot so that if you're inspired by a specific subsystem, you should be able to go buy the parts and build it yourself. We'll also be hosting the code that we have for this robot up on GitHub. Now, keep in mind, we wrote it in 3 days, so it sure isn't perfect, but it's got some cool ideas that I'm excited to see teams leverage and use more in their robots. My favorite feature is that it automatically moves the arm up as you extend the intake, so that you're not trying to pick up the robot with the intake system. If you have questions about this, the FTC Starter Kit robot, or other parts we sell at goBILDA, make sure to shoot us an email to tech@gobilda.com.